Everyone believed Margaret Vale was simply a grieving widow. For 3 weeks, the curtains of her little cottage had remained half-drawn. Every morning, she sat beside the upstairs window with a cup of tea, growing cold in her hands, watching the people of Bellwood Village go about their ordinary lives. No one blamed her for keeping to herself. Her husband, Edward, had been buried only 21 days earlier. He had been a quiet man, a retired schoolmaster who preferred gardening to conversation and books to company. Their marriage had lasted 38 years. Margaret had loved him, or at least, that was what everyone believed. Then, one Tuesday morning, another woman was found dead, and Margaret Vale said something that made the village fall silent. She knew how the woman had died. The police had told nobody, not the woman's family, not the village doctor, not even the vicar. Yet Margaret knew, and that was the beginning of a mystery that would uncover a secret buried for almost 40 years. Bellwood was the kind of village where nothing seemed to happen. The church stood at the center of everything, its grey stone tower visible from nearly every cottage. There was a bakery beside the village green, a small post office, a library that occupied an old manor house, and a narrow lane leading toward the woods. People knew one another's routines. Mrs. Whitmore opened her curtains at 7 every morning. The baker delivered bread at 8. The vicar walked to the church at 9. And Margaret Vale always bought 2 apples from the market on Wednesday, until her husband's death. After that, she stopped going. She stopped attending church, stopped visiting the village shop, stopped answering the door. People began whispering, "She's taking it badly." Edward was all she had. "Give her time." Margaret heard them. She heard everything, but she said nothing, because there was something she had never told anyone about her husband, something she had promised herself she would take to the grave. On the morning of October 14th, Inspector Daniel Reed arrived in Bellwood. He had been sent from the county town after the village doctor reported an unexpected death. The dead woman was Eleanor Price, 67 years old, widowed, well-respected. She lived alone in a neat stone cottage at the edge of the village. Her body had been discovered by her neighbor at approximately 7:30 that morning. There were no obvious signs of violence. The front door was locked. The windows were closed. Her purse was untouched. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. At first, it looked like a natural death. Then Dr. Samuel Harris noticed something unusual, and by 8:30, Inspector Reed had been called. The news spread quickly. By 9 o'clock, villagers stood in small groups outside the church. They spoke quietly. Eleanor had been healthy. She had attended the harvest supper only 2 evenings earlier. She had laughed. She had danced. She had even complained about the weather. Nobody understood how she could suddenly be dead. Margaret watched from her upstairs window. She saw the police cars. She saw Dr. Harris enter Eleanor's cottage. She saw Inspector Reed speaking with the vicar. Then she saw something else. A man standing across the road. He was watching Eleanor's house. Margaret recognized him. Her fingers tightened around the curtain. "No," she whispered the word so quietly that even she could barely hear it. The man turned. For a moment, their eyes met. Then he walked away. That afternoon, Inspector Reed visited Margaret. He knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Then the door opened. Margaret stood there wearing a dark grey cardigan. Her face was pale. "Mrs. Vale?" "Yes, I'm Inspector Reed." "I know." He paused. "You know? I saw your car." Margaret stepped aside. "Please come in." The cottage smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Photographs covered the mantelpiece. Margaret and Edward at their wedding. Margaret and Edward beside a seaside cottage. Edward holding a fishing rod. They looked happy, almost painfully happy. Inspector Reed removed his hat. "I'm sorry to disturb you. You have a question." He looked at her. "How did you know?" Margaret's face changed. "Know what?" "That Mrs. Price had been poisoned." She stared at him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Margaret quietly sat down. "I didn't say she was poisoned. You said, and I quote, 'Someone finally used the same poison.'" Margaret looked toward the window. "I shouldn't have said it. No, you shouldn't have known it." She closed her eyes. "I know." That evening, Bellwood had a new subject of conversation. Margaret Vale knew something. The question was what? At the village pub, theories multiplied. Some believed she had witnessed something. Others believed she and Eleanor had been enemies. A few suggested that Edward's death might somehow be connected. That particular rumor died quickly. Edward Vale had died peacefully in his sleep. Everyone knew that, or thought they did. The following morning, Inspector Reed received the medical report. Eleanor Price had indeed been poisoned. The substance was an old form of cardiac medication, a carefully measured amount, enough to kill, not enough to be obvious. Dr. Harris looked troubled. "I've only seen this type of poisoning once before." "When?" "Nearly 40 years ago." Inspector Reed stared at him. "Where?" Dr. Harris hesitated. "In Bellwood." The inspector returned to Margaret. This time, she invited him inside without being asked. "You've discovered it," she said. "Discovered what?" "That Eleanor wasn't the first." Inspector Reed sat opposite her. "Who was the first?" Margaret looked at the photograph of Edward above the fireplace. "My husband." The inspector's expression hardened. "Are you telling me Edward Vale was murdered?" Margaret shook her head. "No." "Then what are you saying?" She leaned forward. "I'm saying Edward knew who had done it." The room seemed suddenly colder. Inspector Reed looked toward the fire. "Mrs. Vale, please." Her voice trembled. "Before you ask me anything else, you must understand something." "What?" "Some secrets don't disappear. When the people who created them die, they wait. And sometimes," she looked directly at him, "they come back." The first clue was discovered in the village library. It was a photograph, old, faded, nearly forgotten. Inspector Reed found it inside a box of parish records while searching through documents relating to Bellwood's past. There were 7 people in the photograph. A younger Eleanor Price stood near the center. Beside her was Edward Vale, and beside Edward was Margaret. But the photograph had been taken 40 years earlier, before Margaret and Edward were married, before Eleanor became a widow, before any of them had become the people Bellwood knew. Written on the back were 5 words: Bellwood Summer, 1958. "Never forget." Inspector Reed stared at the photograph. Then he noticed someone else, a young woman standing at the edge of the group. Her face had been scratched away. He took the photograph to Margaret. She looked at it for only a second. Then she began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a few silent tears. "I hoped no one would ever find that." "Who is she?" Margaret didn't answer. "Mrs. Vale." "Who is the woman whose face has been scratched out?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Her name was Clara." "What happened to her?" "She disappeared." "When?" "The summer of 1958. Margaret finally told him the story. Clara Bell had been 18 years old. She had worked at the old Ashbury estate. She was intelligent, beautiful, and ambitious. Edward had been 24. Eleanor had been 26. The 3 had been close, too close. Then Clara discovered that money was disappearing from the estate accounts. She threatened to tell the authorities. But before she could do so, she vanished. The village had assumed she had run away. No body was ever found. No investigation followed. And within months, everyone stopped asking questions. Everyone except Edward. "Why did he keep searching?" Inspector Reed asked. "Because he knew she hadn't run away." What did he know? Margaret looked toward the photograph. He knew someone had killed her. Who? I never learned the name. But Edward did? I believe so. The mystery deepened when Inspector Reed discovered that Eleanor Price had been involved with the Ashbury estate. She had worked there as a secretary. And according to an old ledger, She had handled the accounts. Inspector Reed also learned that another person connected to the estate was still living in Bellwood. Arthur Whitmore, the wealthiest man in the village. He was 81, and he owned the manor house that had once belonged to the Ashbury family. Arthur Whitmore received the inspector politely. "I remember Clara. Did she disappear?" "Yes." "Did you know what happened?" Arthur looked out toward the gardens. Everyone had theories. "Do you?" He smiled sadly. "At my age, Inspector, one learns that some questions are better left unanswered." "That sounds like a confession." Arthur's smile disappeared. "No, it sounds like experience." Meanwhile, Margaret received a letter. There was no stamp, no return address, only her name written in black ink. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 6 words. Edward should have kept silent. Margaret dropped the letter. Then she heard footsteps outside. Someone was walking away from her cottage. She rushed to the window. The lane was empty, except for one thing: a black umbrella disappearing around the corner. That evening, Margaret went to the church. She had not attended since Edward's funeral. The vicar found her sitting alone in the back pew. "Mrs. Vale, I need to speak with you." "Of course." Margaret looked toward the altar. "Do you remember Clara Bell?" The vicar's face changed, only slightly, but Margaret noticed. "You know about her?" The vicar swallowed. "My father was the vicar in 1958. And he told me something before he died." "What?" "He said Clara didn't leave Bellwood willingly." The church bell struck 6. Margaret looked toward the darkened windows. "What else did he say?" The vicar hesitated. "He said there had been an argument at Ashbury Manor the night Clara disappeared." "Between whom?" "Edward Vale and Eleanor Price." Margaret's heart sank, because there was one thing she had never told Inspector Reed. On the night Clara disappeared, Edward had come home with blood on his shirt. Margaret finally told Inspector Reed everything. It had happened 38 years earlier. She and Edward had been newly acquainted. He came to her father's house late one evening. He was frightened. There was blood on his sleeve. She asked what had happened. He refused to answer. Then he said something she had never forgotten. "Clara is dead." Margaret had wanted to call the police, but Edward stopped her. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because if I tell them what I know, someone else will die." She had believed him, and that decision had haunted her for decades. Inspector Reed listened in silence. "Why didn't you tell anyone after Edward died?" "Because I was afraid." "Of whom?" "Everyone." "Even now?" Margaret looked toward the window. "Especially now." The police searched Ashbury Manor. Behind a loose panel in the library wall, they discovered a small wooden box. Inside were old letters, receipts, a key, and a photograph of Clara. But the most important discovery was a letter written by Edward. It was addressed to Margaret. She had never seen it. The letter contained only one sentence: "If Eleanor ever dies the same way Clara did, look beneath the clock." Inspector Reed returned to Margaret. "Where is your clock?" She stared at him. "Edward's clock?" "Yes. It stopped working years ago." "Where is it?" Margaret slowly pointed toward the hallway. The clock stood beneath a staircase. Its wooden case was covered in dust. Inspector Reed opened the back. Nothing. Then Margaret remembered something. "Wait." She moved closer. "There is a compartment." She pressed a hidden latch. A small drawer opened. Inside was a key and a folded piece of paper. The paper contained a name: Arthur Whitmore. Arthur Whitmore was arrested the following morning, but Miss Marple would have said the police had solved the wrong mystery too quickly. And indeed, they had, because Arthur had not killed Clara. He had helped hide the truth. The real killer was someone else. Someone still living in Bellwood. Someone who had been present at every important moment. Someone everyone trusted. The answer came from the photograph. The scratched-out woman was not Clara. She was someone else. Her name was Evelyn Hart. Evelyn had been Clara's closest friend. She had witnessed the argument at Ashbury Manor. She had seen Clara leave with someone, and she had spent 40 years believing she was responsible for what happened next. Evelyn was now the village librarian. Beatrice Hart, the same quiet woman who had helped Inspector Reed search the old records. When Inspector Reed confronted her, Beatrice did not deny it. "I didn't kill Clara. Then why hide her?" "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of whom?" "Of Eleanor." Beatrice explained everything. Clara had discovered that Eleanor had been stealing money from the Ashbury estate. But Eleanor was not acting alone. Arthur Whitmore was involved. Clara threatened to expose them. That night, Eleanor confronted Clara. The argument became violent. Clara fell. She struck her head. She was alive, barely. Beatrice had arrived moments later. Eleanor begged her for help, but instead of calling an ambulance, Eleanor left, and Beatrice was too frightened to stop her. Clara died before morning. Beatrice helped Eleanor conceal the evidence. Then she spent 40 years carrying the guilt. But Eleanor was murdered, Inspector Reed said. "Yes. By whom?" Beatrice looked toward Margaret's cottage. Eleanor finally told Edward everything. Edward was going to expose her, but Edward died before he could. "Then who killed Eleanor?" Beatrice began to cry. "I did." Inspector Reed stared at her. "You. I couldn't let her hurt anyone else." "You poisoned her." "Yes. And then you allowed Margaret to take the blame." "I didn't. You knew Margaret would be suspected." "I thought." Beatrice lowered her head. "I thought Margaret knew the truth." Then Margaret entered the room. She looked at Beatrice. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Finally, Margaret said, "Clara was still alive when you found her." Beatrice nodded. "I could have saved her, but you didn't." "No." "Why?" "Because I was 18. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "And Clara was 18. The room became silent. Two old women stood facing one another. Two lives shaped by one terrible night. The truth about Clara Bell finally became public. Her remains were discovered beneath an abandoned section of Ashbury woodland, exactly where Beatrice had said they would be. The village gathered at the church. For the first time in 40 years, Clara's name was spoken openly. Margaret stood near the back. She held Edward's old photograph. She thought about the man she had loved, the man who had known the truth, the man who had been too afraid to reveal it. Inspector Reed approached her. "Are you all right?" Margaret smiled sadly. "No." Then she looked toward the church window. "But I think I finally can be." Beatrice Hart was taken into custody. Before leaving Bellwood, she asked to speak with Margaret. "I am sorry." Margaret looked at her. "Sorry for what?" "For everything." Margaret was silent. Then she said, "You cannot change what happened." "No, but you can stop carrying the lie." Beatrice began to cry. Margaret reached out and held her hand. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Perhaps it never would be. But it was compassion. And sometimes compassion is the first step toward forgiveness. Weeks passed. Bellwood slowly returned to normal. The church bells rang. Children played near the village green. The bakery opened every morning, and Margaret finally began leaving her cottage again. One afternoon, Inspector Reed visited her. He carried a small package. Inside was the old photograph of Clara. The scratched section had been carefully restored. For the first time in 40 years, Clara's face could be seen. Margaret stared at it. She was beautiful, yes, and so young. Inspector Reed nodded. Margaret touched the photograph gently. "That's the tragedy." "What?" Everyone kept thinking about the secret. She looked at him, but nobody thought enough about the girl. That evening, Margaret walked to the church. The sun was setting. Golden light spread across the village rooftops. The church bell rang 6 times. Margaret stopped at the gate. For the first time since Edward's funeral, she smiled. Not because the past had disappeared. It hadn't. But because it no longer controlled her. And there was one final mystery. Inspector Reed never understood how Margaret had known Eleanor had been poisoned before the police announced it. He asked her one evening. She smiled. "Edward told me." When? Years ago. He had discovered the poison used in Clara's death, and he kept the information. He was afraid. "Then how did you know Eleanor would be killed?" Margaret looked toward the setting sun. "I didn't." "You guessed?" "No." She smiled faintly. "I heard Eleanor tell someone." "What?" she said. "If Margaret knows, she will tell everything." Inspector Reed stared at her. "So you knew Eleanor was afraid of you?" "Yes, but you didn't know she would die." "No." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I only knew that someone was frightened. And frightened people," Inspector Reed finished the sentence, "can be dangerous." Margaret nodded. Months later, Margaret returned to the village market. For the first time in nearly a year, she bought 2 apples. The shopkeeper smiled. "2?" Margaret looked at them, then smiled back. Old habits. She walked home beneath the autumn trees. Bellwood was peaceful again, but Margaret knew something the village had forgotten. Secrets do not disappear. They wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. And when they finally return, they rarely come alone. Perhaps that is why the smallest details matter. The forgotten photograph, the locked drawer, the old clock, the letter nobody was meant to find. And the woman everyone thought was simply grieving. Margaret Vale had known something was wrong, long before anyone else. But she had not known everything. Because sometimes the person who knows the most is not the person who knows the truth. It is the person who has spent the longest time living with the questions. And in Bellwood Village, one question remained long after the case was closed. How much would you be willing to hide to protect someone you loved? If you enjoyed The Widow Who Knew Too Much, tell us in the comments. When did you first suspect Beatrice? Did you believe Margaret was hiding something? And which clue gave the mystery away for you? If you enjoy cozy British mysteries, classic detective stories, village secrets, and long-form whodunits, subscribe to Golden Age Mysteries and join us for our next investigation. Until then, keep your eyes open, listen carefully, and remember, the smallest clue may be hiding the biggest secret.